Welcome back to my channel. Please like and subscribe for more from Worlds Collide. Chapter 7. Intense Training. Shay and I awoke early the next morning, preparing for our reluctant meeting with Dr. Shrifa to receive our biomonitors. I harbored reservations about the procedure, primarily the invasion of our privacy. It was one thing to monitor my changes from the nanites coursing through my body, but tracking our personal involvement screamed invasion of privacy at every level of my being. I didn't know if Shazy shared my reservations. If she did, she said nothing. Crathen modesty bordered on nearly non-existent. Even without their light silky garments, most I'd encountered possessed dense fur coats to conceal their anatomy, something I obviously lacked. Since I finished preparing in short order, which was typical, I grabbed a brush to help comb out the stray tufts of her fur. It was a tedious undertaking, but I'd come to enjoy the soft, rumbling purr that grew loudest when we were alone. I reveled in her scent, which had shifted over the months from sweet pine to a damp forest musk. I'd asked her about the change a couple weeks back, and she'd blame me for it. There was, of course, the other scent, the one I knew if I could smell, others could too. Thankfully, no one had brought up the subject, at least not in my presence. I could only imagine my reaction if they had. I would have hidden forever, or worse, died of combustion. To my regret, Shacy finally declared an end to her grooming session. She slipped on her crimson civilian tunic, fastened her gold belt, and announced it was time. The trip was brief, but we moved with a trepid slowness down the corridor to the medical bay, where Dr. Shrifa awaited. "Good morning, doctor," Shacy uttered dryly. Shrifa handed a tablet she'd been studying to one of the technicians with a nod. "Good morning," she responded cheerfully. "I'd like to collect some blood samples from you, Commander," she said, pointing at one of the many empty beds. Shacy remained silent, simply settling on the edge of the closest bed. "Marish will draw your blood while I finish calibrating the equipment." The equipment proved far more inconspicuous than I expected. It was small, gunmetal in color, not much bigger than a quarter cut into a half-moon shape, and attached behind the ear with an irritating, though not painful, pinch. They did have to shave a small patch of fur from behind Shazy's ear to seat it properly. "It will take several minutes to calibrate properly to your natural neural rhythms," the doctor stated. "Can we see, doctor?" I inquired with genuine medical curiosity. Dr. Shrifa's ears flickered in surprise. "Of course, but the information can be difficult to interpret." She swiped her hand across the tablet toward a larger monitor embedded within the wall. The screen flashed to life, revealing two sets of bio readings: lines for neural function, cardiac rhythms, respiratory rhythms, blood pressure, heart rate, current lab values, and other miscellaneous metabolic values. I scrutinized the information for several long minutes, deciphering the meanings in my head. It had been years since I'd needed to understand such data, but my old emergency hospital training slowly resurfaced. "Wow," I exclaimed. "That's the lowest I've seen my blood pressure and cholesterol levels in years." The nanites definitely worked overtime to translate the symbols into common English I could recognize. Shrifa's ears shot straight up and swiveled toward me. "You can understand the readings?" Astonishment reverberated in her voice. Even Shazy was staring at me, but with pride rather than surprise. "I was a combat medic," I replied absently, still studying the screen. "Do all human medics receive this type of training?" Shrifa asked with open curiosity. "No," I admitted, without really paying attention. I had begun comparing our readings, which looked eerily similar. "I worked in a military emergency room for 3 years before being sent to combat as a medic specializing in battlefield trauma. I received additional training required of my position as a senior emergency specialist." I glanced at the doctor. "Can I see a typical Crethan bio readout?" The doctor blinked in surprise. "Of course." A typical Crethan bioscan appeared on the screen beside ours. I returned to studying what I saw, having already forgotten the staff watching me with open curiosity. Shacy's readings weren't noticeably different from the typical scan, except for the gamma waves, which in humans monitored peak focus and consciousness, but seemed a bit more heightened in her. Mine were only slightly lower, but not by a significant amount. The other four seemed mostly normal. The metabolic rates governing how the body metabolizes fats were significantly higher in Crethan than humans. The disparity was obvious to anyone looking at the screen. What they likely wouldn't notice was that my base metabolic rate was nearly triple what was normal. Look here, I pointed. This isn't a normal base metabolic level for an average human male. I glanced at the doctor to make sure she was following. Mine is about triple what it should be. This shows mine, in particular, has increased 400% since I last saw them. Shrifa began furiously making notes on her pad. What can you tell me about the heart rate and blood pressure? Average human heart rate is around 60 to 90 beats per minute. In humans of peak fitness, the resting heart rate can dip into the low to mid-50s. Mine was curiously closer to 110. The Krathen resting heart rate I had to compare to was closer to 140. I pointed to the blood pressure. Human ranges seem similar to yours. I looked at the doctor once more. I'd be interested in your research if you would allow it, I asked. She snapped her head back up as though poked. If you work with me to fill in data on basic human anatomy and physiology, I think something can be arranged. Of course, doctor, I said. My own health might depend on it one day. We left the medical bay, completely forgotten by the staff who were intently focused on the information I had provided. I wish I had access to my medical journals, I remarked conversationally as we headed for our meeting with Miotre and what would be our new team. I didn't know you were medically trained, Shay commented. Honestly, I shrugged my shoulders. Most of the information was gibberish to me. I only selected what I knew to make them believe I understood more about what they were doing than I actually do. Shay gave me a sideways glance, a slight curl of her lips forming what I recognized as a smile. It was a look only I understood. To anyone else watching us, it would appear like a mild snarl of irritation. So, what does a combat medic do? We stabilize wounded long enough to get them to a hospital, was my casual response. That's the official job, I added. And the unofficial? We protect ourselves and those around us with extreme prejudice. I smiled back at her with a predatory grin. We entered a room filled with a half-dozen people of mixed backgrounds, security, military, and communications. They all sat around a table with tablets in hand. I'm glad the doctor could finally spare you, grumbled Miotre. We can begin. I've already briefed the team on your plan. Since most of us here are military or security, I thought we should begin with rank structure. After brief introductions, I commenced by listing out the ranks from the four main branches, all the way from the lowest enlisted to the highest officer. I intentionally avoided what I thought might be more sensitive information, such as how many commanded each. I elaborated more on the enlisted than the others, especially my own sergeant rank. I was surprised to learn that C, Tra, and Trey attached to Krathen names were denotations of rank and not actually part of their names. I mentally scolded myself for missing what was now so obvious. I also learned that what I thought were the doctors' and captains' names were actually rank and position, not their given names. They were both the same rank, but Fea meant doctor and Ma meant ship captain. So is Mio a name or position? I asked, dumbfounded. Name, Mio remarked in annoyance. You can still call me Miotre. It was comforting to see some things didn't change between cultures. I used to tell younger soldiers my first name was Sergeant, not Seth. I could understand the purpose behind it. It bred familiarity that could lead to insubordination. I voiced as much, and Mio nodded approval. I couldn't offer much in the way of comparison for our Navy, since we only possessed naval ships that I was aware of. The Air Force was no different. I did describe them as the spoiled branch, and then the Marines as brainwashed killers. I couldn't help it. Old habits die hard. I knew my opinion when it came to our politicians was skewed negatively. Everyone I knew personally held a similar view of their worth. By the expressions within the room, theirs were similar, I imagine. We discussed the pros and cons of interacting with military, politicians, scientists, and the general public if it came to it. I still advocated for contacting the general population as a whole to force a measured response from both governments and militaries. One military officer argued for first contact with the militaries first, while a security officer advocated for approaching governments first. Neither is quick to inform the public of anything. If I had only those two to choose from, I'd choose the government official publicly so they'll have to admit your existence. I shrugged. No intelligent human trusts their government. The meeting continued for 6 hours. We paused once for lunch, but otherwise pushed through until the end of shift. I fended off questions and did my best to dispel dangerous concepts. Many ranged from plausible avenues of approach to lunacy. The one consensus was the need for a familiar face to perform the introductions. Who that would be was still up for debate. Shro, or rather Shro, joined us for dinner, along with a communications specialist by the name Gracia. He appeared young to me, but my estimation of age was far from idealistic when it came to the Krathen. Gracia was tall and slender, about 3 or 4 inches taller than Shay. His dark gray fur lay tight against his skin. Only the wisps of light-colored fur outlined his ears and stood out on the ends. I laughed at the banter between my 3 companions as they joked casually. They were engrossed in a conversation about the differences between their various geographical regions. I gleaned more about them in the hour and a half they insulted and joked. Gracia was apparently from a small island just south of their equator, where the air was warmer and wetter. His entire family were fishermen by trade or worked the docks. Shro grew up in the mainland plains north, where the growing seasons were most ideal. The geography was mostly flat, with low rolling hills that extended for hours in any direction, according to her. They grew protein-rich vegetation used to synthesize food replacement to maintain their growing population. "Where did you think the food you eat comes from?" She scoffed at a snide comment from Gracia. "Not all of us can just eat from the ocean." She looked at me, poking herself in the chest with a clawed finger. "My family employs a couple hundred workers. I'm expected to return home after my service to take over the farms." "What about where you are from?" I asked Shay. The other two grew deathly quiet, as if I had encroached on a taboo subject. Shay chewed her food thoughtfully, swallowed, and set her utensil down gently. "We have very few growing things. Our warm season lasts about 2 cycles at most, since little grows in the mountains. Most of our food is either imported or hunted." She rubbed her arm suggestively. "It is very cold around my home," she said elusively. "We live in vast subterranean caverns throughout the year." "Shay is almost royalty," teased Gracia. Shay snapped him a dangerous look, and he suddenly became fascinated with his meal once more, as he refused to meet her glare. Shro urgently had somewhere she needed to be. She excused herself and snatched the young officer by the ear to lead him away. I watched them beat a hasty retreat, their tails almost between their legs. I glanced at Shay, who attempted to resume her meal, stopped and slid it away with a sigh. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Did I ask something I was not supposed to?" Shay shook her head. "No, we need to talk, but not here." I cleared the abandoned trays before we left. One of the mess crew dipped and raised his ears in thanks before returning to the task of cleaning around one of the tables. We walked back to what I thought would be our room, but Shay led me down a corridor I had not been before. "Where are we going?" I inquired. "To the forest room," she declared. The trip to the forest room took us to the uppermost deck, and to a room that opened into a vast wooded chamber with a clear ceiling filled with the passing of stars like snow blowing past a windshield. Without the pollution of Earth's atmosphere, I could see the cornucopia of colors emanating from a nearby nebula. The air was clean, almost pure, with the scent of filtered mineral springs that weaved throughout the base of the vegetation. The canopy of trees was filled with the sounds of birds and other animals I could not make out. They did not exist on the ship, of course. They were instead produced by audio devices cleverly concealed throughout the terrarium. The animals themselves were colorful holographic representations to give the illusion of life. "This is beautiful," I whispered. I was half afraid to make too much sound, lest I disturb the mythical illusion of purity and life. Shay said nothing. She simply continued to lead me through the trails to another bulkhead at the far end. The doors grumbled apart with slow, deliberate motion. The instant the bulkhead began to separate, a frigid blast of air rushed out to assault of my lightly clothed body. I shivered involuntarily. I was definitely not dressed for the occasion. We took one step inside and stopped. The frost-covered white walls in the room glistened like glitter, like some Christmas story. It was not very big, maybe 20 or so feet in either direction, with benches littering the floor with no discernible pattern. I turned to watch her expression. Her eyes stared out into the distance, without focusing on anything other than possibly a memory. "This is what my home feels like. It is both desolate and remote. The white caps of the mountains are littered with gray and black rock. Most of the mountain peaks are shrouded in clouds that conceal the sky from view. Above them, nothing exists except bare, jagged peaks of the most inhospitable environment we have. I was almost convulsing with cold as it kissed my skin in a painful, fiery burn. Shay stood with her eyes closed and her head raised. Her thick fur insulated her in ways that I envied on a biological level. I refused to retreat despite the agonizing burning sensation that covered my arms. My fingers had already gone numb within minutes of entering the room. "I will not leave you here alone," I chattered uncontrollably. Shay opened her eyes to look at me searchingly. "You say that now." A pained expression filled her face as she led us from the room. The doors behind us echoed shut with a dull, ominous sound. The forest room felt tropical in comparison to the blistering cold, despite being temperate when we first arrived. Blood and feeling slowly began to return to my extremities like billions of tiny biting ants swarming all over me. I was still shivering despite the warmth when we walked a few yards away to an awaiting bench made of what appeared to be wood, but was synthetic heavy carbon fiber. We sat in silence until my body finally began to settle enough to function normally, and my voice steadied. "I see I will need to acquire special Arctic gear." I was used to the cryogenic holding units where I had worked that were kept at -80 degrees Celsius. I had gone into the room on several occasions without protective gear, but only for a couple of minutes. It was usually tolerable for 10 or 15 minutes unless the cooling fans were running, and then I could only tolerate it for 2 or 3 minutes. The room we had just left made the cryogenic fans feel like a late spring breeze. "My father controls 3 of the largest mines on our planet," she said without looking at me. "He supplies more than 50% of the black tungsten used to build our ships and orbital stations." She paused and then continued. "That is just on our home planet." "So, he is rich?" My voice held an arrogant dismissal at the idea. I did not care about money. It was just a means to an end. "Rich? Yes. More importantly, though, is the amount of influence he exerts within our government." Shay was watching me now. "He is cold, calculating, and used to getting his way." I shrugged dismissively. "I get why you may not like him, but that is nothing to be ashamed of." The Shay I knew was anything but cold. The warm, playful smile she reserved for me was evident of that. She could be cold and calculating, but so could I when the situation required it. I did not like being that way, and I knew she shared the sentiment. Shay shook her head, and her ears flattened. "I am not ashamed. I am afraid of what he will do when he discovers our bond." I took her hands in mine as I searched her eyes intently. "Our bond is everything. I will stand beside you no matter the cost." "He will use his influence to enforce his will," she cautioned. "Let him try," I rebuked. I allowed my eyes to turn cold and my expression hardened. "Only death will take me from you." "That is what I am afraid of," she breathed. The pain of loss before it had even materialized filled her expression. It was then that I saw something I had never seen her do. She wept silently. A heartbeat of surprise broke my composure, to only be replaced by hardened resolve fueled by barely restrained anger. "Then I will learn to become more predator than prey," I hissed. "What good are my enhanced abilities if I cannot capitalize on them?" We returned to our room an hour later. It had taken some time for Shay to regain her composure. Even with the false bravado of a confident officer, she emanated fear and anxiety. I lay staring at the ceiling long after she had fallen asleep, curled against me. I could not sleep. My mind raced with a multitude of rash ideas fueled by my fear and anger. I feared for her and raged because I could not face down that which caused her pain. Unable to stand it any longer, I carefully untangled myself from her almost crushing grip and slid from beneath her heavier frame. I grabbed the military duffel that contained my gear and slipped off to the washroom to change. I emerged from our room 15 minutes later and studied my wrist computer in the hall. I needed directions to the military section. Craven stepped aside and watched me stride down the military section as though I belonged there. I might not be one of them, but I knew how to be a soldier, and I was on a mission. I stood outside Stalker Captain Latra's quarters an hour later, staring at his door, suddenly apprehensive. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and hit the chime. I waited for a breath, then two. The door whooshed open finally on the third chime. "Why are you outside my door, human?" he growled dangerously. Latra was massive, even without his combat armor. Where most Krathen were generally slender but fit, he loomed over me as though I were a child. I could see the thick, sinewy muscles whose contours were amplified by his almost metallic flat fur. "I want you to teach me to fight as you do," I countered sternly. I felt like a small child full of bravado while standing his ground against a bully despite knowing a beating was coming. "Go away," he spat dismissively before beginning to turn away. "I will not," I barked. "I want to learn." He stopped and looked back at me with a measuring look. "I need to learn," I finished less secure. "I see," he said finally after studying me closely. "You finally learned who Shay really is." He turned again to walk away. "Be in training bay 4 every day within 1 hour of shift end," he said over his shoulder as the door slid shut. My body instantly drained of energy, and I let out a breath I had not known I was holding. I did not know how the encounter would go, but I suspected this had been the easy part. I returned to the guest wing where our room was. There were very few people in the halls at this hour. By the time I had undressed and gingerly slid back into bed, it was already third watch. "Where you go?" mumbled Shay, stirring slightly. I could not sleep. I went for a walk to clear my mind. She nuzzled her face against my chest, coiled her tail around my leg, and drifted back to sleep. Morning arrived too early. My body ached from the abuse of the day before and lack of sleep. I ran through the day on autopilot. We stopped in at the medical bay, just like any other morning, before attending the information dissemination briefings. I contributed as expected, but I did not really pay much attention to them. Many of my responses were absent contribution because I spent much of the day studying Latra's public military file. Latra had been in the military for what equated for 30 Earth years. He held several awards, most of which I had no comparison to base my assessment. He did have more than 24 conflict ribbons. One was against a race called Stalith, which was interesting. I did not know there was another race besides human and Krathen. It had never occurred to me that there would be others. I researched the stalkers with intent curiosity. I assumed they were much like Earth Marines, but they were an independent team comprised of only 11 members. The bulk of the ground forces on the ship were something else entirely, comprising close to 100 personnel. Most of the soldiers had more extensive records. Where one unit had transparent files, the stalkers were an enigma. Schro joined us for dinner again that evening. Conversation was a more speculative continuation of the long meetings. Each tossed around ideas about how to integrate what they were learning into their own system. Even Shay contributed more enthusiastically to the conversation. I listened with detached interest and clarified bits of information when needed. I excused myself in the middle of a debate on Earth cats. I nuzzled Shay briefly and departed with the excuse of wanting to exercise. She didn't question me, but I could discern the question sitting in her eyes. I managed to change into my military uniform and arrive at the training room with about 10 minutes to spare. Latra moved fluidly through an intricate series of positions that reminded me of a martial artist. I didn't disturb him, just watched in complete silence. "What do you expect to learn?" he asked without looking at me during his routine. "To protect myself," I responded instantly. "Then you should have remained on Earth," he countered. I considered the question further before speaking again. What did I expect? I expected to learn new skills. But why, I asked myself. I eventually decided the best course of action was honesty. It was embarrassing, though I didn't know why. Maybe because I lacked the skill to fulfill my promise, unless it was my promise to die. "I need to know how to fight the unknown," I started. "I must protect my mate, even if it means my life." "What do you know so far?" he inquired. "Nothing," I stated flatly. Latra completed his exercise by coming to attention, facing me. "Good." He began to circle me slowly, analyzing me. "I read your limited file." "And I yours," I countered. He gave me an amused Krathen smile. "Our medical treatment has provided you some useful tools. We will start by developing those further," he stated. "Human senses are inferior. Your people are weak without their toys. You are too easily broken." As if to illustrate his meaning, he struck me with an unexpected blow. I detected it too late to avoid the concussive impact to the side of my head. He hadn't used a closed fist, yet it left my head ringing as I staggered to my feet a couple yards away. I shook my head to clear the ringing in my ears and straightened. "I will not quit," I growled. "Good." He stood to his full height and crossed his arms. "I will wash my hands of you if you quit." It is out of personal curiosity that I agreed to this. "Close your eyes," he ordered. "Use your ears, as primitive as they are, and track me." I did as he instructed and strained to listen through the diminishing ringing. I held my breath at first without success. All I could hear was the beat of my own heart. I stood stiff, trying to focus without moving, until I felt something hard hit me in the back. It wasn't a fist, but it made me gasp. I could hear it bounce dully on the decking before rolling away. I straightened just as another struck me in the gut, causing me to double over with a loud grunt. "Listen!" he roared, and I snapped my head to face him without opening my eyes. He was quiet once more, and I lost track of his movements. "You are small." "Weak," he taunted. "Your ability to listen and anticipate will be your greatest chance to survive." Another ball struck my leg, but just before it impacted, I thought I heard a faint scratch of claws on metal, and I turned toward it before my leg was knocked out from under me. "Good." "What did you hear?" "Claws scratching metal," I answered. Another ball impacted my shoulder. No sound preceded it this time. I could hear the slight rush of air as the environmental systems hummed overhead. I stood again, but this time I felt like I was reacting to ghosts. I jerked my head around to face every perceived sound. No more balls struck me. I began to think I was alone in the room until I heard the bulkhead door open and close. I opened my eyes then to find myself standing in the middle of an empty training room. I cursed under my breath. I was about to leave when I changed my mind. Pieces of exercise equipment lined the walls. Irritation slowly gave way to curiosity as I studied some of the resistance and weight machines. I pulled off my top, tossed it onto the back of some strange piece of equipment that looked like something out of a horror movie, with articulating bars attached to cables running along its length. I opted for something more traditional that I recognized. I picked up a bar with digital settings on either end containing numbers. There was no weight, but the bar was heavier than expected. I read the numbers. 110. I strode through the hall back to my quarters. My arms were jello, and my stomach ached from the workout. Shay looked up from her computer when I entered the room. "How was your exercise session?" I stopped briefly to nuzzle her before quietly disappearing into the washroom. I stripped slowly in front of the mirror. My entire body was aflame. I could make out yellow bruises covering my body where Later had thrown the balls. For something soft enough to bounce, they sure hurt. I winced as I pressed on one to gauge the damage. Nothing permanent. The shower proved to be a welcome distraction as it burned my skin, but also washed away the weariness and pain. Of course, it produced its own form of pain, to which I had begun to become accustomed. It was either that or maintenance had finally gotten around to adjusting the temperature to something more tolerable to my human physiology. I leaned against the shower wall once I was clean. All motivation washed down the drain with the top dozen layers of skin and grime. It was all I could do to stand motionless until the alarm chimed and the water shut off as though giving up on me. Shay was still in the common room when I emerged draped in a towel. My hair was still damp and water ran down my shoulders and chest. My feet left small wet footprints across the floor all the way to the common room. "My arms are screaming," I grumbled. I tried to lift them with minimal success to attempt to massage her shoulders. I instead resorted to wrapping them around her and laying my chin on her shoulder. "What you working on?" Shay leaned her head against mine in acknowledgement of my presence. "I've been reading over medical reports Shrifa forwarded." My attention was instantly captivated. "Anything new?" "Not really." She toggled off the screen. "Everything looks the same as it had yesterday." Every day was a repeat of the last. Medical in the morning, briefings all day, training and weights in the evening. Training with Latra followed the same direction every day. Each day I returned with new bruises, but I refused to quit. I had eventually enlisted Shay's help to learn to focus my hearing. After my shower, we would sit quietly in the middle of the common room as I struggled to focus on the smallest sounds. We even went to the forest room a couple of times to present new challenges. The forest room provided an opportunity to focus on individual sounds, while learning to block out others. I began to win small victories in my training time, and each time Latra would dish out new punishment as a result. He never inflicted any permanent damage, but it felt as though I were being killed slowly by his version of a death by 1,000 cuts. I began adding running to my routine in the second week. At first, I tried using the machines to work out, but felt like I was going nowhere fast, just the same stationary movement while staring at the same spot on the wall. Other stalkers joined me occasionally, but said nothing. I got to observe combative training on 2 occasions. I paid close attention to their movements. When they left, I self-consciously tried to mimic the moves I had studied. I expected someone to walk in while I tried to combine the moves into a coherent semblance of form. I eventually started running the corridors to both explore and build endurance at the same time. I didn't run fast, but I did push myself to move continuously. No walking, no resting. The only days I didn't run were the days I used the weights to build strength in my legs. Each time I worked my lower body, I would stagger back to our quarters like a drunken sailor. I was halfway through week 3 when I finally managed to catch one of the balls hurtled at my head. Latra called an end to the training early that evening. He gave me a look of almost approval before he left, but it stopped there. Latra was nowhere to be seen the next day. Instead, another smaller stalker stood in the middle of the training room, holding a long staff. She didn't say anything, simply throwing a second staff at me, which I caught. She just nodded before taking a stance, and I copied her pose. She brought her staff around and stopped. I mimicked her every move. When she wasn't satisfied, she simply used her own staff to correct my posture. Any illusion I had about ending the day without a new bruise was shattered each time I made a mistake. Her nudging wasn't gentle, often resulting in a resounding smack followed by stinging pain. I returned home each night looking almost like a zebra, haphazardly striped. Shay scrutinized me with suspicion every time I returned. She never commented on the bruises, but I felt certain she noticed them. Very little escaped her attention. Medical reports streamed in every couple of days, and I would review them, logging notes for Shrifa. I reappeared one evening with my right eye swollen shut, a result of dropping my guard during a sparring session with the staff. It hadn't been on purpose, of course. I simply misread the move and attempted to block a low swing that had sailed high. The impact sent me sprawling across the floor on my side, landing with a heavy thud. The blow had stunned me enough to prevent me from trying to brace myself. The stalker, who I learned was called Profre, simply extended her staff for me to grasp, hauling me to my feet. She betrayed no emotion, said nothing, only offered the end of her staff and used it to pull me up. "Forgot to duck?" Shazy remarked dryly, a brow arched. "Zigged when I should have zagged," I grumbled on the way to the shower. Shazy waited on the bed when I emerged, motioning for me to lie on my stomach. I stretched out, the good side of my face resting on my crossed arms, as she straddled me and began massaging my ever-abused shoulder and back muscles. "Sho mentioned you've been training with Prof. Ray this week," she observed conversationally as she worked a rather stubborn knot loose. I could only manage a grunt of pain in response. It took several long minutes of work, but the muscle eventually yielded to her ministrations. "I love you," I mumbled into my arm. "When were you finally going to inform me you approached Latra?" Shazy burrowed into another knot, lower this time. I imagined my ears would have flattened in distress had they possessed the ability to do so. "I figured he didn't like me and wouldn't hesitate to punish me," I explained. "I needed someone to push me." "You risked much with him." She shifted to rubbing my back instead of continuing the torture session. "His sister's offspring was part of my team." I rolled my head and shoulders to peer back at her. "Nobody said," I accused. "What would it have changed?" she purred. She allowed me to roll onto my back. "Everything," I countered. "His death was not your fault," she uttered softly. "Latra knows this, but it doesn't alter how he feels about humans." "Then why did he agree to train me?" The revelation about Latra's nephew struck me hard. I didn't feel sorry for him. I was sure he'd never want that from me, but I couldn't help but feel sympathetic. "Because you asked." Shazy leaned forward and began to lick the edges of my injured face. My eye had begun to open now. The nanites performed their job well. I would have been in the medical bay 100 times over without their help. "Should I?" "No," Our lips met in a soft but urgent kiss. I was breathless by the time we reluctantly parted. We savored each other that night. It was the first time since I had started training that we had been intimate. It felt awkward at first. Nearly every movement irritated some injury that had yet to heal fully.
Subscribe to be notified of more adventures of Mitchell and Shay in Worlds Collide.